In today's video, we're going to be breaking down some footage of an AC-130 gunship completely destroying a hidden terrorist compound built into the side of a mountain. The footage in this video can be disturbing at times, so viewers' discretion is heavily advised. We will also be looking at some footage of an AC-130 and an Apache gunship working together to rescue a team of Green Berets who were trapped inside a Taliban village, followed by an AC-130 flying way closer to the ground than it ever should in order to protect a team of American special operators. Remember to like the video and subscribe to help support the channel, and definitely go check out the Patreon linked down in the description. It's where I post all of the uncensored combat footage YouTube won't let me show you here. We just passed 35,000 members on Patreon, which is an absolutely insane goal, so thank you guys so much for all the support. But with that, let's get into this video. November 2nd, 2016, a 12-man Army Special Forces team was caught in the middle of one of the deadliest ambushes of the war. Traveling with the 12-man Green Beret team was a group of Afghan Special Forces, bringing their total number up to about 50 men. They were making their way through a long, narrow alleyway in the village of Bos Kandahari when they were suddenly ambushed by a large group of enemy insurgents. The insurgents opened up on them with machine gun fire and frag grenades coming from the windows and the buildings surrounding them. It was a nasty place for an ambush, and within seconds of the firefight kicking off, almost half of the team was badly injured. Immediately, the team leader put over the radio for the team to push forward through the alleyway, deeper into the village and out of the kill zone. So the half of the men that weren't badly wounded began dragging and carrying their wounded teammates through the alleyway under heavy fire. As they were making their way down the alley, Staff Sergeant Richard Hunter, the team's Air Force combat controller, put out a request for air support over the radio. Thankfully, an AC-130 gunship and multiple Apache helicopters were already in the air. Within minutes of the start of the firefight, the AC-130 above opened up on the village with its 105mm howitzer cannon. The impact of the explosive ordnance slamming into the village had more benefits than just killing Taliban fighters. It shook the entire village and kicked up so much dirt into the air that it made it nearly impossible to see on the ground, giving the operators on the ground still stuck in the alleyway enough cover to make their escape. The rounds of the AC-130 gunship were impacting directly on the enemy's position, which in some cases was about 10 meters from the Americans. All they could see was explosions and clouds of dirt all around them, with little bits of pink mist from the Taliban fighters getting absolutely annihilated by the AC-130. Once the AC-130 ran out of its 105mm, the Apaches followed in with a barrage of Hellfire missiles. After the first barrage of Hellfire missiles made contact with the enemy's position, the smoke from the battle became so thick that the team on the ground had to maneuver blindly through the village with the help of the AC-130 overhead giving them directions. And it was at this point that the team's ground force commander was mortally wounded. Sergeant Hunter quickly ran to the ground force commander and placed his body between him and the enemy fire, using his body as a shield as he tried desperately to move the wounded man back towards cover. Thankfully, with the directions of the AC-130 gunship overhead, the team was able to put some distance between them and the Taliban fighters, allowing the Apache gunships to fully open up on the enemy. And it didn't take long after that for the village to be completely cleared of all hostile fighters. By the end of the battle, 2 American soldiers and 3 Afghan soldiers had lost their lives. Between the AC-130 gunship and the Apache helicopters, more than 27 Taliban fighters were eliminated. Several days later, the incident sparked widespread scrutiny after reports of heavy civilian casualties emerged. A military investigation later determined that 33 Afghan civilians were killed in the village that day. Officials ultimately concluded that the U.S. forces had acted in self-defense and were cleared of all wrongdoing. And Staff Sergeant Richard Hunter received the Air Force Cross, which is second only to the Medal of Honor, for his incredibly heroic actions that day. March 29th, 2017, a small team of American and Afghan Special Forces were preparing to return back to their outpost after a successful mission when they were ambushed and pinned down by a force of more than 65 heavily armed ISIS fighters. The enemy was armed with small arms, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, suicide vests, and improvised explosive devices. Not only were the Americans outmanned and outgunned, but they were stuck out in the open while the enemy was fighting from a well-fortified position. Unfortunately for the ISIS fighters, the Americans had an AC-130 gunship overhead. The AC-130 gunship immediately opened up on the enemy, and things were starting to look up for the operators on the ground. But unfortunately, these ISIS fighters were smart and they had dealt with American air support before. They knew that if they could get close enough to the American fighters, the AC-130 would no longer be able to engage them. So they quickly pushed as close up to the Americans as they possibly could, making the fighting on the ground even more intense than it already was. And their plan worked perfectly. The AC-130 could no longer safely engage the enemy and had no choice but to cease all fire. But the crew of this AC-130 gunship was not going to abandon the operators on the ground. They made the daring decision to fly lower down to the ground, making it to where they could safely and accurately engage the enemy even with them so close to the friendlies. However, there was a reason AC-130 gunships didn't fly this low to the ground. Going that low would put them within effective range of enemy anti-aircraft artillery, as well as portable air defense systems, which they knew these enemy fighters had. But the crew decided this was a risk they were willing to take, so they lowered their altitude, and for the next 90 minutes they laid down 21 danger close strikes as close as 35 meters away from the American operators. During these danger close airstrikes, the crew had to deal with and work through multiple malfunctions on all three guns while dodging enemy artillery, and they stayed on target way longer than they should have, risking running completely out of fuel. If you've ever rolled into a gas station with your car telling you have 0 miles to empty, this is basically what they did in an AC-130 gunship. But at the end of the battle, the AC-130 gunship's crew managed to kill more than 39 ISIS fighters. And due to the extreme skill and bravery of the crew, the Americans and Afghans on the ground returned to their outpost without suffering any casualties. It's unbelievable how brave each and every crew member was during this mission. On the night of April 3rd, 2019, U.S. Army Special Forces assaulted one of the largest ISIS strongholds in all of Afghanistan. This compound was so well fortified that it is commonly known as ISIS-K's Pentagon. Air Force Special Tactics Officer Major Jeffrey Wright, the man who led the fire support element of the assault, said that he would have to reach for examples like Normandy or Hamburger Hill to appropriately convey the degree to which the enemy was prepared and ready for their assault. This was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The installation was dug into the side of a mountain with only a single path through which friendly forces could assault. The base inside was a complete and total nightmare, with underground tunnels connecting operations centers and staging areas and well-placed barricades allowing enemy shooters to surround friendly forces and shoot down at them from all sides and angles. On top of that, the enemy defending the base was well trained and committed. These ISIS fighters had successfully defended their base from 3 previous assaults. Major Wright said, "In my 20 plus years of training and experience in the art of attacking and defending ground objectives, I have seen few more formidable defensive positions, or ones more daunting to attack." Major Wright and his 7-man Special Tactics team were tasked with supporting the Army Special Forces company assaulting the compound. The enemy stayed hidden until the American forces drew close. Once the Americans were within the kill zone, an intense firefight broke out, where the lead elements were completely surrounded by enemy fighters. ISIS fighters also used the underground tunnels to reappear behind the friendly forces in buildings they had already cleared. Just outside of the enemy base, there's a small village, and the American operators cleared the village on their way to the compound, but the enemy then used tunnels to go underground under the Americans and pop back up in the buildings behind them they had already secured. Despite the American soldiers having way more men and firepower on their side, the situation was dire. Thankfully, the crew of the AC-130 gunship, call sign Spooky 41, was there to help. The combat controller with the lead element of the Special Forces Company radioed Spooky 41, and the air crew responded immediately with accurate fire. Similar to the last operation we were looking at, the ISIS fighters quickly tried to push closer to the Americans so the AC-130 wouldn't be able to safely engage. But Spooky 41 was having none of that. Any ISIS fighter that tried to push closer to the Americans was immediately ripped apart with accurate fire from the AC-130 gunship. The overwhelming fire support from the AC-130 gave the operators on the ground the room they needed to establish a defensive perimeter and start working towards evacuating the wounded. But the assault force was about to face an even greater challenge. The terrain prohibited helicopters from landing in order to pick up wounded soldiers. Instead, the helicopters would have to perform hoist lifts on the most critical patients, an exposed maneuver which would involve hovering within machine gun range of dozens, if not hundreds, of enemy fighters. But the helicopters were up to the challenge anyway. Multiple helicopters rolled in on target and hovered overhead within range of enemy machine gun fire. Miraculously, Spooky 41's fire was so responsive, precise, and overwhelming that the enemy couldn't respond effectively. The enemy never landed a single shot on any of the evac helicopters. At several points, the AC-130 gunship was engaging different targets simultaneously and on different radios. There were multiple JTACs on the ground who were calling in different targets at the same time, and the AC-130 gunship was receiving those targets and hitting them at the same time. Without Spooky 41's skill, the medevac helicopters would have certainly been shot down. But besides the initial gunshot and IED blast injuries, there were no further casualties on the American and Afghan troops that night, and it's all thanks to Spooky 41. Major Wright had this to say about Spooky 41's incredible actions that night. "I've been to far too many memorials and seen far too many folded flags. I didn't have to do that on this trip because instead of Americans giving their lives for their country that night, Spooky 41 made the enemy die for theirs. On time, on target, and in the most complex environment I've ever seen."